Hey guys, welcome to episode 7 of Custom Card Review. So you may or may not have noticed, but I closed the submission form a couple of days ago because I've got well over 70 submissions to still get through. But if you are a CCG family tier supporter, either here on YouTube memberships or Patreon, and would like to submit another archetype or single card submissions, DM me on Patreon or Discord, or if you don't have either, you can also hit me up in the comments of this video and I'll work out an alternate way for you to submit. Again, you can sign up for the family tier on Patreon or YouTube memberships, and if not from me, you can at least share your custom cards on my Discord. There's a good community there where you can get feedback, give others feedback, get help on PSCT, find a pool of artwork to use for your cards, and so on. So definitely a good resource for custom card creators, and all the links for these things are in the video description. Now, let's dive in. This submission is by Mordekaiser. This is support for the vampire archetype. So the vampire archetype, if you consider an archetype from the initial debut of Vampire Lord, dates back all the way to Dark Crisis back in 2003, and has since then flushed into an archetype that started off in the direction of bleeding the opponent's cards out of their deck, so making them send cards from their deck to the graveyard. And then when that ended up becoming like a thing that actually benefits the opponent, the vampire archetype was taken into a different direction where it's all about stealing your opponent's monsters. So the support here aims to marry those two concepts together and just overall beef up a deck that is otherwise a little power crept compared to some of its modern counterparts. So let's go through them, starting with Vampire Amalleator. If you control a vampire monster with a different name, you can, quick effect, pay 2,000 life points, special summon this card from your hand. You can special summon Vampire Amalleator this way only once per turn. If this card is normal or special summon, you can target one card in your opponent's graveyard, special summon it to your side of the field. If this card destroys a monster by battle, at the end of the battle phase, you can special summon any monster destroyed by this card to your side of the field. Next up is the Vampire Liege. If you would exceed summon a vampire or vampiric monster, you can treat this card and any other vampire monster as level 5, 6, or 8. But if you do, you can only summon vampire monsters and monsters your opponent owns this turn. If this card is normal summon, you can send a vampire card from your hand to the grave, special summon a vampire monster from your hand, then you can declare one card type, monster, spell, or trap. Your opponent sends a card of the declared type from their deck to the grave. If this card destroys a monster by battle at the end of the battle phase, you can special summon any monster destroyed by this card to your side of the field. Now we get to the Link 1 Vampire Taker. Its materials are one vampire monster. If this card is special summon, you can activate one vampire kingdom from your deck or grave. If you would tribute a monster to activate a vampire monster effect, you can tribute monsters your opponent controls instead. Quick effect, you can send one vampire monster from your deck to the grave, declare a card type, monster, spell, or trap. Your opponent sends a card of the declared type from their deck to the grave. Cards sent from your opponent's deck to the graveyard cannot activate their effects until the end of the next turn. You can only use this effect of Vampire Taker once per turn. You can treat any monster owned by your opponent that you control as any level for the exceed summon of vampire and vampiric monsters. So just real quick here, you can only use this effect of Vampire Taker, I believe, is applying to the quick effect. And this effect that says cards sent from your opponent's deck to the grave can activate their effects until the end of the turn should be its own standalone continuous effect. So just for PSCT purposes, I would move this continuous effect to before the quick effect so that the hard ones per turn is clearly pointing to that quick effect. I think that's what you intended for there. Now jumping down to the spells, Tales of the Grim Vampire. When a vampire monster you control would be destroyed, you can pay 1,000 life points instead. If this card is sent from your deck to the grave, you can place this card in your spell and trap zone face up. You can banish this face-up card, set one vampire spell or trap card from your deck or grave to your side of the field. It can be activated this turn. You can only summon vampire monsters the turn you activate that previous effect. And then we have Vampire Charm. If you control a vampire monster, take control of one monster your opponent controls, then you can normal summon a vampire monster. If this card is sent from your deck to the grave, you can set this card. You can banish this card from your grave and target a vampire monster on the field. Send it to the grave, then special summon any number of vampire monsters that are banished, whose total levels are equal or less than the original level of the sent monster. You can only use each effect of Vampire Charm once per turn. You can only summon zombie-type monsters the turn you activate this card's first and third effect. So that is the set of 5 cards. Let's go back to the Amalleator. So with this card, I would just reword real quick. If you control a vampire monster with a different name, you could just say, if you control a vampire monster other than Vampire Amalleator, you can special summon this card, and that's a quick effect. The second effect, I would, also similar thing that I've mentioned in previous videos, where it says you can only special summon Vampire Annihilator this way once per turn. Typically, that kind of hard once per turn is reserved for summoning conditions. Since this is an effect, you would want to have it say you can only use or activate this effect of the card once per turn. And that's just to avoid loops that if in case this card is forced to stay in your hand, you can't just keep trying to special summon this. It's just for that purpose. The second effect, I think you just need to have either a cost or a stipulation here. If this card is normal special summon, when you bring out that opponent's monster, maybe its effects are negated, or you can only summon zombie monsters for the rest of the turn, something like that. I think there's another vampire card out there that does summon from your opponent's graveyard and does have that restriction that you can only summon zombie monsters for the rest of the turn. So just following suit with that. And then finally, if this effect is cool, I think it just needs to have a activation condition here. So if this card destroys a monster by battle, at the end of the, you can either put the colon here, and then it would activate at that time and then resolve at the end of the battle phase, or you can put at the end of the battle phase colon, and then you can go into the effect. So either way would work fine. So that same thing for the bottom effect of the Liege. Otherwise, the Liege, I think, is a really good card. It helps you to assemble the variety of vampire monsters that are available in the extra deck, so that's cool. The Taker. So it seems like the Link one that fetches the archetype field spell has just become a thing, so that's fine. This effect, if you attribute a monster to activate a vampire monster effect, you can attribute monsters your opponent controls. So that's a very powerful effect. It's very Lair of Darkness-y. And I believe I went through the cards real quick. I think this only works for 2 vampire cards out there, the Fascinator and the Voivode, if I'm saying that right. So since it only works for 2 other cards out there, it's probably tame enough, but this is just one of those effects to keep an eye on. And then I made the point earlier about this other effect being a continuous effect that should come before the quick effect. And I do really like that effect. I think it's a good way to address the weakness of that vampire concept, where you're sending cards from your opponent's deck to the grave, and they're usually getting to choose which card to send, and so that can end up benefiting them. So you have a good way to address it there, and that might actually help to have on a couple of other cards as well, just to make it more consistent. The tails, I think it's fine. Yeah, I mean, the pay 1,000 life points is a pretty steep cost to keep your vampire monsters on board. You might need to clarify here if it's per monster. Like if, for example, if your opponent Raigekis you and you have 2 monsters, do you pay 1,000 life points, or do you pay 1,000 life points for each? So you would have to say when a vampire monster, parentheses S, so monster or monsters you control will be destroyed, you can pay 1,000 life points instead, or you can pay 1,000 life points for each of those monsters instead. So whichever way you're going for, it's fine. The rest of the effects I think are pretty good. I like this effect. When it's sent from the deck to the grave, you can place it in your spell trap zone. I think that's a good way to leverage or branch out the vampire archetype into a subset of different effects. And you do the same thing with this last card over here, which can be set to your field when it's sent from deck to grave, so that's cool as well. Do vampire decks send cards from their own deck to the grave pretty regularly? I don't really know. So I wonder how often you're triggering these effects, but it's cool nonetheless. This effect is this card overall is a very strong card. And I've talked in the past about my hatred. I don't know, hatred's a strong word, but preference to not have non-targeting, non-destruction forms of removal on cards that are easy to activate. I think in this case it's fine. It has those restrictions there at the bottom, where if you do use that first effect, or the third effect for that matter, then you can only summon zombie-type monsters for the rest of the turn. So I think it's well balanced out. So on the grading, on the design, I give an 8. So overall, it's a good buff to what vampires currently do, which, as you outlined in your submission, includes those sending cards from your opponent's deck to the grave, as well as the take control of your opponent's monsters effects. I think you did a good job of designing cards that especially take advantage of the latter, like being able to modulate the levels of monsters you have, so you can go into your Xyz plays, for example. You could build more on the bleeding aspect, the sending cards from your opponent's deck to the grave, by having more effects that take advantage of that. So we talked about with the effect on the Link that blocks off those cards from activating their effects until the end of the next turn. So that's a good stun aspect to have, and I think there might be other ways to branch it out. Again, that's an effect of sending cards. Making your opponent send a card from their deck to the grave is usually nowadays something that benefits them. So branching out the effects in some other fashion to really help you take advantage of those bleeding effects. So it would help to really flesh out that side. The creativity, I give an 8 as well. I don't think this is a super creative batch of cards by any means, but this is one of those times where the creativity is just self-limited by the parameters set forth by how Konami has currently designed the deck. And I think you did a good job of staying within the parameters, but still being able to bend them just enough to expand what the deck is capable of doing. So that's why I give the creativity an 8. And then the balance, I give an 8 as well. Overall, it's good. You know, there's a couple of cards that raise my eyebrows a bit, like the tributing your opponent's monster for effects. But again, that's just so limited in the number of cards that can take advantage of it that I think it's tame enough. So overall, I think the balance is fine, and that gives the average score, straight 8s, an average of 8. So thank you, Mordekaiser, for your Vampire custom support. This submission is by Fuwaboi. This is support for the existing Fluffal archetype, which debuted about a decade ago. So Fluffals are an archetype with 3 branches. There's the Fluffals, there's the Edge Imps, and then there's the Frightfurs, which are the fusions of the deck. This deck has a lot of draw and search power, which is largely driven by the centerpiece card here, Toy Vendor. So this card allows you to pitch a card and draw a card, and if it's a Fluffal monster, you can special summon any one monster from your hand. Otherwise, you discard that drawn card. And then its other effect is if it's sent to the grave, and that can be from anywhere, you can add 1 Edge Imp Sabers or 1 Fluffal monster from deck to hand. So, like I said, a lot of searching and drawing, and sure enough, a lot of graveyard-based effects like you see here. And that's the nutshell, so now let's get into the customs. Starting off with Fluffal Nendoroid. So you can reveal this card in your hand to place 1 Toy Vendor from your deck face up to your spell trap zone. Then if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, place 1 Fluffal monster from your deck to the top of the deck, except Nendoroid. If a Frightfur fusion monster is special summoned to your field while this card is in your grave, you can special summon this card, then destroy 1 card on the field, and you can only use each effect of Nendoroid once per turn. Next, we have Fluffal SH Figure Art. If you control Toy Vendor or it is in your grave, you can special summon this card from your hand. During the main phase of quick effect, you can fusion summon Frightfur fusion monsters in your extra deck. Summon 1 Frightfur fusion monster from your extra deck using monsters from your hand or field as materials. If your opponent controls at least 2 cards more than you do, you can also use monsters from your deck as materials. You can only use each effect of this guy once per turn, or I guess this girl. Next up is Fluffal Polar. If this card is sent to the grave or banished for the fusion summon of a Frightfur fusion monster, you can set 1 Toy Vendor from your deck or grave to your field. If a fusion monster or monsters is sent to your grave while this card is in your grave, you can add it to your hand. You can only use each effect of Fluffal Polar once per turn. And then we have, going into the Edge Imp section of the deck, Edge Imp Claw. If this card is sent to the grave, you can add to your hand or set 1 Polymerization from your deck or grave. You can only use this effect of Edge Imp Claw once per turn. A Frightfur fusion monster fusion summoned using this card as material cannot be targeted by your opponent's card effects. Now we get in another Edge Imp card, Edge Imp Axe. You can either send 1 Toy Vendor from your deck to your grave, or shuffle 1 Toy Vendor from your grave into the deck. Special summon this card from your hand. If this card is sent from hand or field to the grave, you can target 1 spell trap on the field, destroy it. You can only use each effect of Edge Imp Axe once per turn. Now we get into the Frightfur, starting off with Frightfur Goat. The materials are 1 Edge Imp monster and 1 Fluffal monster, so that's typically how the Frightfur fusions work, where you have the Edge Imp and then any number of Fluffal monsters depending on which the fusion is. If this card is fusion summoned, you can take 1 Edge Imp monster and 1 Fluffal monster in your deck and either add them to your hand or send them to the grave. You can only use each effect of Frightfur Goat once per turn. Also, monsters you control gain 400 attack for each Edge Imp monster in your grave. And then we have Frightfur Abomination. The materials for this are 1 Edge Imp monster and 2 or more Fluffal monsters. If this card is fusion summoned, you can send cards from that your opponent controls up to the number of materials used for this card's fusion summon to the grave. If this fusion summoned card leaves the field by an opponent's card, you can either draw cards or special summon Fluffal and or Edge Imp monsters from your graveyard and or banishment up to or equal to this card's fusion materials. You can only control 1 Frightfur Abomination. Just a PSCT thing. You don't need to have up to or equal. You can just say up to this card's fusion materials. And then finally, we have the spell of the custom batch, the Chosen Ones of Heaven and Hell. This is a normal spell. Take 1 Fiend and 1 Fairy monster from your deck, add 1 of them to your hand, and send the other to the grave. For the rest of the turn after this effect resolves, you cannot special summon monsters except Fiend and Fairy monsters, but if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, you can also special summon monsters with the same attributes as those monsters you chose instead of just Fiend and Fairy. You can only activate one, the chosen ones of Heaven and Hell, per turn. So starting back at the top, the Nendoroid. So the thing about Nendoroid is that it's basically an overpowered bear, right? So bear requires you to pitch it to set Toy Vendor from your deck, whereas this is simply a reveal and then a half search, if you will, on top of that by putting a monster on top of your deck, which, as we see from Toy Vendor, is going to combo very well with Toy Vendor. Now, I know Bear is 10 years old, and so the intention here is to bring things up to speed, but personally, I'm not a fan of power creeping cards within their own archetype, such that Nendoroid basically makes Bear and I'm sure people would still run it just so you have basically 6 copies of ways to search out Toy Vendor, but nonetheless, it's just a much better version of a card that already exists in the deck. And even though it's 10 years old, Bear's still a pretty good card. Like, this is still a concept that you see nowadays where you have a card that you can pitch to search. So in that regard, it's still a card that I don't think needs power creeping. And so I get the need to be able to search Toy Vendor in more ways, but I don't think this is the way to go about it. The reason for that is because it's a free search, and I'm also just not a fan of that. Like, typically searching requires you to do something, right? You either, you trade in a card. So for example, you activate a spell to search out a card, or you even have to summon a monster. Like, that either requires you to give up your normal summon or require you to special summon in some sort of way, and then you trigger that effect to get out of search. With this, you're just revealing it, and you get 1.5 searches on top of that. So that's, to me, over the top. Even with more modern cards like Illusion of Chaos or Metal Flame Swordsman, which are both reveal in hand to search, they then require a trade-off, let alone an extra half search on top of it. The second effect is also similarly busted because it's a +2 with an easy to meet condition. I would change this to one or the other, where when you summon a Frightful Fusion monster, you either special summon this card from your grave, or you bench this card from your grave to target a card on the field and destroy it. Next is the figure art. So I like the concept of this card. It gives the deck a built-in response to the opponent's moves that aligns with the core strategy. So a lot of the Frightful Fusions destroy on summon, and so being able to trigger that fusion on your opponent's turn is a good form of disruption. The problem with this card, though, is that last part of the effect, because there are a lot of fusions out there, not a lot, but there's a couple in the archetype, including the one that's in your custom lineup, where there isn't a limit to the number of Fluffal fusion monsters that are part of the materials. So the thing about using cards from your deck is that you could just literally dump your entire deck of Fluffal monsters to be able to fusion summon that monster, assuming your opponent controls 2 or more cards than you do. So because of that aspect of it, I would either just nix this effect completely or restrict it to, if your opponent controls at least 2 more cards than you do, then you can use 1 monster from your deck as material. So limiting it to 1 so that these fusion materials, monsters that have materials of 1 or more Fluffals or 2 or more Fluffals, what have you, just can't use your entire deck for them. Polar I think is fine. Edge Imp Claw is also good to go. Edge Imp Axe, I have a couple of thoughts about this. I'm not a huge fan of the non-cost cost. So basically what that means is that if you have a cost that actually greatly benefits you, in this case, you get to send Toy Vendor from your deck to the grave, and it can't be stopped since it's a cost. All right, so even if the effect or activation is negated, you still have to pay the cost, which means that Toy Vendor is going to get you your search. So it's basically the cost is really getting you a search. So that's what I mean by non-cost cost. So I would make this both of those things part of the effect. So you could word it like, you can either send 1 Toy Vendor from deck to grave, or shuffle 1 Toy Vendor from grave into the deck, and if you do, special summon this card from your hand, something like that. The second effect, it's interesting because you would think in 2024 we have pretty accessible spell trap removal for as far as monsters are concerned. But I think I mentioned this in the last review episode, where if you think about level 4 or lower monsters, really the only thing that is readily popping a spell trap is Breaker, the Magical Warrior. So this one is, the condition is if this card is sent from hand or field to the grave, you can pop a spell trap on the field, which I think it could use a bit more stipulation. So for example, you could say if this card is sent from hand or field to the grave by a card effect, that way you can't abuse it by using it as synchro or link material, and you can't, if you so choose, ram it or have it be destroyed by battle, trigger the deck. Either has to be sent by a card effect, which is pretty easy to do for the deck. You can do it with Toy Vendor, you can do it with a lot of the other cards that you've designed here that the deck already has. So it's still a pretty easy condition to meet. I would just add that in there just to avoid the abuse that could come with extra deck plays. So that's my thoughts on Axe. Going into the fusions, so the Goat is good. It's a double search or a double send to grave, which in both cases, it's fine. I don't think the graveyard effects of this deck are anything too crazy, so I don't mind that. And same thing with the ability to search, like, yeah, other than my thoughts on the first couple of cards. I don't think you're searching for anything that's over the top, especially as far as the cards that are already in the archetype are concerned. A +2 on the fusion summon has been a thing ever since 2008, so it's definitely not out of the ordinary. So overall, I think this card is fine. The abomination, though, is your words, not mine. It's a bit of an abomination. So this is another card where it's clearly just an overpowered version of other cards in the deck, right? So there are two other fusions out there that are the tiger and the whale that both have destruction effects. So if you're going to have a send to grave effect, then there should be a drawback somewhere as well. So for instance, whale doesn't target, but it makes you destroy one card on your side of the field. Tiger targets, but you can destroy a bunch of cards. And then you have this, where you can destroy, well, you can get rid of a bunch of cards in a non-targeting and non-destruction form. So it's clearly much better than Tiger and Whale. And so that kind of makes them extinct. Now, I guess you can make an argument for Whale being able to pop cards on your side of the field, like, for example, Toy Vendor, but that's beside the point. This card is clearly superior to your other fusion plays. And the thing about this deck, this archetype, a lot of people appreciate is it's a non-linear toolboxy playstyle where you go with the move that is best suited for the occasion or best suited for the cards that you have to work with. And I think this card takes away from that. It gives you a very clear-cut, obvious choice of which fusion is worth making. So to bring this one onto the level of the others, like I said, one of them is non-targeting but destroys a card on your side. The other one is targeting but destroys multiple cards. So for this one, since the positive is that it's a non-destruction form of removal, it's sending to the grave, then the drawback could be that it forces you to target, and you can only target one. So it has its pros and its cons compared to the other fusion moves that are available for the deck. The second effect also, I think, needs some restrictions. So this is one of those fusions that has an unlimited number of materials that can go into it, since it's 2 or more Fluffals, and since that first part of the floating effect is you can draw cards equal to the number of fusion materials that were used. So that could be an insane number of cards. I would just get rid of that aspect of the effect. The other effect is limited by the very nature of having only 5 monster zones, so you can theoretically bring back up to 5 monsters with this card. If that still seemed too over the top, then I would just limit it to 2, or like 1 Edge Imp and 1 Fluffal. But overall, I would definitely get rid of the draw card effect, and then just tinker around with the other aspect of it. The floating in general is fine. It's just a matter of how much it's going to float. Finally, we have the spell, the chosen ones. So this is an in-archetype search and a foolish burial all in one go. And for a deck that greatly benefits from monster effects in the grave, that can definitely be overpowered. Usually you either see a foolish effect or you see a search effect, not both in one go. And if you were to see something like that, then you would have a nice little restriction attached to it, which you do. So for the rest of the turn, after this effect resolves, you can add special summon monsters like Fiend and Fairy. Now you have a way to get around that, where if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, you can special summon monsters with the same attributes as the monsters that you chose. And then in archetype, as far as in archetype is concerned, the Edge Imps are dark, the Fluffals are largely earth and also dark, but there's a couple of light and water that are also used. So basically 4 of the 6 main attributes are open up to you if your opponent controls more monsters than you do. The thing about modern day Yu-Gi-Oh! Is that if your opponent controls more monsters than you do, they probably have a pretty good game state going for them. And so they're more likely to be able to respond to whatever you're trying to pull. So I think the restriction there is actually good enough to balance out this card. So on to the grading. I give the design a 7. It's clearly aligned with the Fluffal playstyle in terms of the search and draw effects. One of the things people really like about Fluffal is that they're not linear, like I mentioned, very toolboxy. And I think maybe the support here takes away from that to an extent, but overall a solid design. On the creativity, I give it a 5. So as I've mentioned in the past, creativity on existing archetypes is harder to score high on, so don't mind it too much. I do think the effects of these cards are pretty par for the course, both in archetype and generally speaking, so I'll leave the creativity at an average of 5. And then on balance, I give it a 5 as well. I think there are a number of cards here that are clearly over the top, but there are also some shades of good trade-offs and conditions like we see here with the spell here. And so that gives the average score for the custom support here a 5.7. Thank you, Fuwaboi, for your submission. This submission is by Jamie Kaslana. This is the Siren archetype, a fully custom archetype. So let's go down the list, starting with Guiding Siren Lanice. If this card is normal or special summon, all face-up Siren monsters you control gain 500 attack until the end phase. When this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, target one spell trap your opponent controls and one Siren monster you control. Destroy the first target, also shuffle the second target into the deck. When a card or effect is activated that targets this card, quick effect, you can special summon one level 4 or lower Siren monster from your deck, except Guiding Siren Lanice from your deck. You can only use this effect of Guiding Siren once per turn. Moving on down to the Oblivion Siren. If this card is normal or special summon, add one Siren spell or trap from your deck to your hand. When this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can target one Siren monster you control, banish one Siren monster from your hand, and if you do, set one spell or trap that is banished or in your graveyard. Also shuffle that target into the deck. When a card or effect is activated that targets this card, quick effect, special summon one level 4 Siren monster except Oblivion Siren Nadalis from the deck. Then if you do draw one card, you can only use each effect of the Oblivion Siren once per turn. Going next to the Wrathful Siren Megadola. If this card is normal or special summon, and this is a level 8, target one level 4 Siren monster you control, shuffle it into the deck, then randomly banish one card in your opponent's hand. If a Siren monster you control is shuffled into the deck, your opponent must special summon one monster with an equal or lower level from their deck to the field if possible. Its effects are negated, then it must battle this card if possible. If this card battles an opponent's monster, quick effect, destroy that monster, then special summon one level 4 Siren monster from your deck. You may only use each effect of the Wrathful Siren once per turn. Next up is the Youthful Siren Limodia. If this card is normal or special summon, you can target one face-up level 4 Siren monster you control. It can make a second attack during each battle phase this turn. If this card battles an opponent's monster, you can target one monster your opponent controls and one Siren monster you control. Negate the effects of the first target, also shuffle the second target into the deck. When a card or effect is activated that targets this card, quick effect, special summon one level 4 or lower Siren monster from your deck, except Youthful Siren. You can only use each effect of the Youthful Siren once per turn. So that does it for the monsters. Now we move into the spells and traps, starting with Archangel Duality. If this card is always treated as a Siren card. If a monster you control would be destroyed by battle or would leave the field by a card effect, you can banish this face-up card you control instead. You can only use each effect of the following effects of Archangel Duality once per turn. During your main phase, target one face-up special summon level 4 light monster you control. It gains this effect. When this card battles, your opponent cannot activate monster effects until the end of the damage step. When this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can add one level 4 or lower, or one level 4 light fairy monster from your deck to your hand. Or the other effect is during your main phase, you can target one face-up level 8 dark fairy type monster you control. It gains this effect. When this card battles, your opponent cannot activate spell, trap cards, or effects until the end of the damage step. When this card destroys an opponent's monster by battle, you can banish that opponent's monster, then draw one card. That is quite the doozy of an effect on this card. Alright, and then the last card is the Counter Trap Serene Siren. During your battle phase, you can activate this card from your hand. When your opponent activates a card or effect in response to the activation of your Siren monster's effect you control, banish one card from your hand or graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy that card. Then, if you control one face-up level 8 Dark Fairy monster, you can special summon one level 4 or lower Light Fairy monster from your hand or graveyard. You may only activate one Serene Siren per turn. Alright, so let's go back through, starting with Guiding Siren Lanice. So this one I think is really solid for the deck. I think it's a good card. No complaints here, no recommendations here. The Oblivion Siren, so there's a couple of things. The first effect is fine. The second effect is pretty stringent on what you have to do. So you have to destroy an opponent's monster by battle, then you banish a Siren monster from your hand and shuffle one that you control into the deck, all to set one spell or trap that is banished or in your graveyard to your field. Now, I get that you're getting any spell or trap. It's not like it's forcing you to get an archetype specific one. So maybe that's why you made it so stringent. But the destroying an opponent's monster by battle is already a pretty tough condition to meet. And then, since it's part of the theme of the deck to shuffle Siren monsters you control back into the deck, you can keep that one too. And I think you can just nix this one right here where you banish one Siren monster from your hand. I think the other two conditions are more than enough to balance out this effect. And then the second effect is also interesting. So all the light level 4 fairies have this effect, where when a card or effect is activated, it targets this card, special summon one level 4 Siren monster, except the one that is of the same name of the one being targeted. But then this one goes a step further and has a draw 1 card. Like, that's not on Lanice, and it's not on Lamodia. So I wonder why it's here. And I don't think it should be here. The fact that you're already getting a special summon from the deck is pretty good. So I would just nix that draw 1 card. Also, it just seemed like maybe it was there previously on all 3 of them, and then maybe you got rid of it on 2 and forgot to get rid of it on this one. I don't know, but I would get rid of that anyways. Moving on to the Wrathful Siren. So with the first effect, if a Siren monster you control is shuffled into the deck, or I guess the second effect, your opponent must special summon one monster with an equal or lower level from the deck to the field possible. Its effects are negated and must battle. So you just need to specify when exactly this has to happen. Like, it could just be as simple as this turn, or put a condition here like that this effect only activates during the battle phase or something. But then you also need to take into consideration whose turn it is, because if it's your opponent's turn, then yeah, you could just say they have to battle at this turn, and then your opponent has to enter their battle phase and has to attack with that monster and attack into this monster. If it's your turn, you would have to give this card an additional attack. So the way you have it worded, I get maybe you're probably just trying to simplify the wording, but you have to specify that on your opponent's turn, they have to declare the attack, and then on your turn, this card can get an additional attack. Or just leave it that it doesn't get that additional attack on your turn. Whatever is most effective and what you're going for, but yeah, it just needs that clarification there. The other effect, if this card battles an opponent's monster, quick effect, destroy that monster. So just specify here when exactly this effect is activating. Usually these kinds of effects are at the start of the damage step. And then it doesn't need to be a quick effect. If this card battles an opponent's monster at the start of the damage step, destroy that monster, something like that. If you meant it at the time of the declaration, that could also be fine. So just depending on what you were going for here. The Youthful Siren, also a really good card. No issues here. It's a good design on that. And then moving on to the spell. So the Archangel Duality. This is like I said, a doozy of a card. I like what the effect is doing. I just think it's doing way too much. I checked the word count here. This is 176 words, which is up there for one of the most wordy cards of all that Konami has designed. And you're talking about cards like Pendulum monsters that have, the spell effect and the monster effect. As far as spells and traps go, this easily clears. Like, I think typically the max word count on spells and traps is like around 120, 130. So the fact that you're into the 170s is too much. So you either need to have a simpler way to say this, or just take out parts of the effect, because it's too much on one single card. I don't have any problem with the effects themselves. It's just too wordy of a card. And then the trap is another great card. I think it's well designed, goes with the theme of the deck, really well done. So that's the 6 cards. I give the design a 8 and 8. Other than tweaking that spell, I think that the design here is really cool and well thought out. The creativity, I give an 8 as well. It's a good collection of effects and theming. I don't really know too much about sirens, other than like they would lure, if we're talking about like Greek mythology, they would lure sailors toward them and cause them to drown, something like that. I don't know if that's the siren lore that you're basing this off of, or there's some other siren lore out there. Typically, I'd like to see the adaptation of the lore into the effects, and I'm not sure if I'm seeing that, but also I'm not sure where exactly you're sourcing the material from. But overall, the creativity is pretty good anyways, because the effects are very varied, so that's cool. And then the balance, I give an 8 as well. Nothing here is really OP, and actually, on the contrary, some of it might be too unbalanced against yourself. So it like that double cost and the trigger condition on Oblivion. But overall, it's really well balanced. It has clear defined conditions to meet effects, clear cost, and the payoffs are pretty decent as well. And so with the straight 8s, that gives an average score of 8. So thank you, Jamie, for the Siren Archetype submission.